Tu podcast diario de inglés.
All right, let's dive into this one. It's a story that's it's pretty bizarre, but also fascinating. We're going way back to 1814 London,
Oh, okay.
the St. Giles district to be exact.
Yeah, right.
So picture this bustling working class neighborhood, crowded streets, merchants hawking their wares, all the sights and smells and sounds of everyday life in the heart of the city.
Sounds busy.
Yeah, imagine that. But then suddenly there's this powerful flood.
Okay, a flood.
Yeah, but not of water.
Oh, not water. What else floods?
Well, that's what makes this event so unique. It wasn't a natural disaster.
Yeah.
It was, it was a man-made deluge of epic, and you could say slightly sticky, proportions.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are we talking about here?
We're talking about the Mew Brewery.
Ah, a brewery.
Yeah, one of London's largest at the time. And they were known for producing some really high-quality brews.
Okay, so we've got a huge brewery in a crowded part of London. What happened? Something went wrong.
You could say that. You see the brewery, it housed these massive vats. They were wooden tanks reinforced with iron hoops.
Okay.
And each one, get this, each one could hold thousands upon thousands of gallons of beer.
Whoa, that's a lot of beer.
It is. And one of these behemoths, well, it decided to spontaneously burst.
Burst, like it exploded.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And the result, a torrent of beer, literally taller than a person in some places, surging through the narrow streets of St. Giles.
Oh, wow. That's, what? I can't even imagine the chaos.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
Okay.
But, you'd expect panic, wouldn't you? But from the accounts we have, it seems like Londoners, they met the situation with this mix of shock, but also their trademark dark humor.
Really?
Yeah. There's this story about a man caught right in the middle of it all, the beer flood. And he throws his hands up in the air and he just shouts, "Finally, some refreshing rain."
That's great. Always got to find the humor, right? Even in a beer flood.
Exactly. But, as funny as it sounds, this wasn't just a funny mishap. I mean, there must have been some serious consequences to this, right?
Oh, absolutely. You're right. While the image of people wading through beer is pretty amusing, the reality is this flood caused some significant damage. Homes and businesses were destroyed. And tragically, several lives were lost just because of the sheer force of all that rushing liquid.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the absurdity of it all. But yeah, that's a sobering reminder that even amidst the funny side of things, there was real tragedy.
Yeah.
So how did the city cope with all the aftermath?
Well, Londoners are known for their resilience. And this was no exception. What I find interesting is how they incorporated this disaster into their collective identity.
Really? So they didn't just clean up and forget about it?
No, they turned it into a piece of local folklore.
Wow, so they embraced it as part of their story.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
The beer flood became this source of humor, a tale to be told and retold in pubs and on street corners. And the newspapers, they had a field day. You had headlines like, "The Great Beer Deluge." Or "London drowns in a sea of ale."
I love it. It's incredible how quickly something like this can go from a disaster to a legendary tale.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, are there any lingering traces of the beer flood in London today? Could you still see it somehow?
That's a great question. While the physical evidence is probably long gone, I wouldn't be surprised if you could still find whispers of this event in the city's pubs. Maybe a subtle nod in a pub name or a story passed down through generations of Londoners.
That would be amazing. I mean, it's fascinating to think how this event, this sudden surge of beer through the streets became so intertwined with London's identity. But let's step back for a second. You mentioned those massive tanks that held the beer. What was the brewing technology like back then?
Well, brewing in the early 1800s, it was a much different process than what we see today. These weren't your sleek stainless steel tanks you find in modern breweries. The tanks at Mew, they were enormous, made from wood and held together with iron hoops. They were essentially gigantic barrels, and each one held enough beer to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm trying to picture the scale of these things. It must have been quite a sight. But it also makes you think, if they were so large, why weren't they built to be more secure?
Well, that was a question that a lot of people were asking after the flood. The inquiry that followed, it revealed that the tank that burst, It had been showing signs of wear and tear for a while. There were concerns about the quality of the wood and whether the iron hoops were strong enough to contain the immense pressure of all that liquid inside.
So it wasn't just a random freak accident. There were underlying issues that contributed to the disaster.
Absolutely. The incident really highlighted the need for better safety standards in breweries. It forced people to reconsider the materials being used, the construction methods, and the overall safety protocols. It's a reminder that sometimes, even the most unexpected events, they can lead to important advancements.
It's true. It makes you think about the ripple effect of this whole thing, not just the immediate impact of the flood, but the long-term changes it sparked in the brewing industry.
Exactly. The Great Beer Flood of 1814, it wasn't just some quirky historical anecdote. It was a turning point. It forced people to confront the risks that came with brewing on such a large scale and prioritize safety in a way they hadn't before.
Absolutely. And while we can laugh at the image of Londoners wading through beer, it's important to remember that this event had a profound impact, both on the city and the industry as a whole. But before we get too serious, I have to ask, what happened to all that beer? Did they just, let it all go to waste?
Well, that's a question for the ages, isn't it? Imagine the scramble to try and salvage what they could from that river of ale. But I suspect a good portion of it just ended up being absorbed into the cobblestone streets of St. Giles, leaving behind, I'd imagine, a rather pungent aroma.
A sticky, beery situation indeed. It makes me think about the people who actually lived through this. What must it have been like to just wake up one morning and find your street transformed into a brewery runoff?
It must have been a truly surreal experience. The cleanup effort alone, I can't imagine. But it also speaks to the resilience and adaptability of Londoners. They didn't let this event define them. They incorporated it into their collective narrative, turning a disaster into a legend.
And that's a pretty impressive feat. I'm curious, though, beyond the humor and the folklore, what were the actual tangible consequences of this flood? Does it have a lasting impact on the brewery itself?
That's a great question, and one that deserves a deeper dive. The impact on Mew Brewery was significant, both in terms of their reputation and their finances. They faced lawsuits from those affected by the flood, and then there was, of course, the substantial cost of rebuilding and implementing all the new safety measures. It's a stark reminder that even with a seemingly humorous event like this, there were real-world consequences to grapple with.
So it's not just a story about beer and laughter. It's also a story about accountability. About the responsibility of businesses to ensure the safety of their operations. But before we delve further into the aftermath, I think it's time we take a closer look at the social and cultural context of this event. After all, this wasn't just a flood, it was a flood of beer, a beverage that holds a special place in British culture. What was the significance of beer in 1814 London?
Well, beer in 1814 London, it wasn't just a drink, it was practically a way of life. Clean drinking water was scarce, so beer, even weak small beer, it was a staple for people of all ages and social classes. Consumed at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it was a source of hydration, calories, and, I imagine, even a bit of social lubrication.
So this wasn't just a flood of any liquid. It was a flood of something essential to their daily lives, something deeply ingrained in their culture. That adds another layer to the story, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It makes you think about the symbolic nature of this whole event, A flood of beer in a city where beer was so integral to everyday life. It's almost like the city itself was being overwhelmed by its own cultural staple.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's not just a physical flood, it's almost a metaphorical one, representing something deeper about the relationship between London and its beloved beverage.
Precisely. And that brings us to an intriguing point. How did this event, this dramatic and somewhat comical flood of beer, shape the way Londoners viewed themselves, their city, and even their relationship with beer? That's a question we'll explore further in our next segment.
I can't wait to dive deeper into that. So, for our listener, as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, just imagine yourself transported back to that bustling London street. Picture the chaos, the surprise, the sheer absurdity of a wave of beer surging through your neighborhood. And keep in mind, this isn't just a funny story. It's a glimpse into a historical moment that reveals a lot about 19th century London, its people, its culture, and the surprisingly complex relationship between a city and its beer. We'll be back soon to unpack the aftermath and explore the lasting impact of this extraordinary event.
It's fascinating how this event, tragic as it was, it seemed to solidify London's reputation for finding humor in the face of adversity.
That's true. We've talked about the jokes and the headlines, but I'm curious about the deeper impact on the city's identity. Did this flood actually change how Londoners saw themselves?
It's hard to say for certain, but I think it definitely reinforced some existing perceptions.
Oh, how so?
Well, they were already known for their stoicism, their ability to kind of weather storms.
Right.
Both literal and figurative. And this event, in a strange way, it almost celebrated that spirit.
So instead of being traumatized by it, they turned it into a badge of honor. Like, hey, we're the city that can handle anything, even a tsunami of beer.
Exactly. It becomes a testament to their resilience.
Yeah.
And it plays into this idea of London as like a city of stories where even disasters are woven into the fabric of everyday life.
It makes me think about the pubs, the heart of social life back then. Can you imagine the tales being swapped over pints?
Right.
I bet the story became legendary.
Oh, absolutely. Pubs would have been buzzing with firsthand accounts, embellished details,
Oh, yeah.
and of course, jokes galore.
Wow.
It's easy to imagine the beer flood becoming a staple of local lore passed down through generations.
For sure. And that brings us to an interesting point. You mentioned lawsuits and financial repercussions for the brewery. Did this event lead to any lasting changes in the industry? Maybe in terms of safety regulations?
You hit the nail on the head. The Great Beer Flood, this wasn't just a local spectacle. It sparked a national conversation about brewery safety. The inquiry that followed, well, it revealed some serious shortcomings in, tank construction and maintenance practices.
So this tragedy, in a way, kind of forced the industry to confront its own vulnerabilities.
Exactly. The incident led to stricter regulations, improved construction standards, and a greater emphasis on preventative measures.
Wow.
It's a classic example of how a single event, however bizarre, can trigger significant and lasting change.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? This flood of beer that was meant for, consumption and enjoyment, it ended up prompting a wave of reform in the very industry that produced it.
Yeah.
But beyond the regulations and the industry impact, I'm curious about the human side of the story. What happened to the people whose homes and businesses were destroyed?
Well, unfortunately, the historical records, they focus mainly on the spectacle of the event, not the individual stories of loss and recovery. But,
yeah.
We can imagine the hardship faced by those directly impacted.
Right.
The brewery, they did provide some compensation, though it likely wasn't enough to cover the full extent of the damage.
Of course not. It's a reminder that even with something seemingly comical, there were real people who suffered, who had to rebuild their lives in the aftermath.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of remembering both sides of the story. The humor and the tragedy, the resilience and the loss. It's a nuanced picture, just like the city itself.
Yeah, speaking of nuance, let's go back to that idea of beer as a staple of life in 1814 London. You mentioned it was safer than water, but what else can you tell us about its role in society back then?
Well, beer was more than just a beverage back then. It was a social lubricant, a source of community, and it even played a role in the economy. Pubs were like gathering places, centers of news and gossip, and vital to the social fabric of London.
So this wasn't just a flood of any liquid. It was a disruption to a way of life. It's almost poetic in a way.
It definitely adds a layer of depth to the story. Imagine the impact on daily routines. The sudden absence of this readily available, almost essential beverage, it must have been a strange and challenging time for many Londoners.
It really makes you wonder how the event might have altered their relationship with beer. Did it change their consumption habits? Did it maybe lead to any social or cultural shifts?
That's a question worth pondering. While we may not have any concrete evidence, it's certainly plausible that the flood sparked some conversations about responsible consumption, the potential dangers of large-scale production, and maybe even the importance of clean water initiatives.
It's amazing how a single event, however absurd it seems on the surface, can trigger such a cascade of consequences, both immediate and long-lasting.
And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's full of these unexpected turning points.
Yeah.
These moments that reveal the complexities of human life and the interconnectedness of our actions.
It makes you think about the stories we tell about our own communities. Every place has its own unique history, its own collection of strange and wonderful events that kind of shape its identity.
Absolutely. Those local legends, those quirky tales, they offer a glimpse into the heart and soul of a place. They remind us that history isn't just dates and names in textbooks. It's about the lived experiences of people, the events that shape their lives, their communities, their very sense of who they are.
And sometimes those events involve a sudden, unexpected deluge of beer.
Exactly. You just never know what seemingly insignificant moment might become, like a legend, right? It could be a natural disaster or a peculiar invention, or even, as we've seen, a brewery mishap of epic proportions.
It's true. It's a reminder that history is full of surprises. And often, those surprises are what make it so fascinating. But let's bring it back to our beer flood for a moment. As we wrap up our deep dive, what key takeaways do you hope our listener walks away with?
Well, I hope they've gained a newfound appreciation for the sheer absurdity of history. This event, the Great Beer Flood of 1814, it's a stark reminder that the past is full of these unexpected twists and turns, often stranger than fiction.
Absolutely. It's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find humor and camaraderie even when faced with chaos and adversity.
Precisely. And I think it also highlights the power of storytelling, how a community can take a tragic event and turn it into a piece of their shared identity, a tale to be told and retold, passed down through generations.
And in doing so, they not only preserve their history, but also find a way to make sense of it, to find meaning and even laughter in the face of the unexpected. So for our listener, think about the stories that shape your own community. What are the legends, the myths, the historical events that have become part of your local lore?
Delve into those stories, explore their origins, and consider how they've shaped the place you call home. You might be surprised by what you discover. And you might even find yourself sharing those tales with others, contributing to the ongoing narrative of your community.
Because ultimately, history is about connection. It's about understanding the past, both the good and the bad, and recognizing how those events have shaped the present and continue to influence the future.
And sometimes it's about acknowledging that even a flood of beer can have a profound impact on a city, an industry, and the lives of those who experience it.
Well said. So, until our next deep dive, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep sharing the stories that make history come alive.